Games take a long time to develop. Gone are the days of the NES where Capcom would release a new Mega Man game every single time Keiji Inafune sneezed. Modern game development is slower, more expensive, and far more complicated than it's ever been, and both publishers and fans are still adjusting to that reality. Announcements come earlier, development cycles stretch longer, and years can pass with nothing but silence. Nintendo fans in particular seem to have suffered from this. It took them years to release the first trailer for Tears of the Kingdom after we got a teaser for it all the way back in 2019, and when it finally released, it ended up being the longest gap between mainline entries in series history, and for a game that was supposed to be an asset flip no less. Pikmin 4 was unofficially confirmed to be in development all the way back in 2015, and yet it didn't get teased until 2022. Arguably the holy grail of these games, however, was Metroid Prime 4. This game was announced in 2017. June of 2017. I wasn't even a Metroid fan then. Since then I've played every single game in the series, most of them multiple times. This is one of my favorite franchises in gaming, and while I can't pretend to have been waiting nearly as long as others had been for Prime 4, it's still the game that I've been anticipating for the longest time. So after 8 years, a public restart in development, and more radio silence than just about any Nintendo game in recent memory, could it have possibly been worth the wait? No. First, let me get this out of the way. This review is going to be a very critical one, but I by no means dislike this game. I think that there are a lot of weird decisions and one or two outright missteps, but overall I think that moment to moment this game is very good. I've been consistently surprised by just how gorgeous each Metroid title has looked this past generation, and Prime 4 is no different. Retro studios have truly outdone themselves, which is saying a lot. The intro cutscene alone blew me away. On the surface, everything here looks up to the standards set by previous games in the series, which is a good thing. Combat is the best that it's ever been in a Prime game, with a few asterisks. This is the first time that Prime has been designed with a standard twin-stick control scheme from the very beginning. Previously, all other original entries either used a weird tank control setup, locked you into using pointer controls, or released on a console that in no way was built for playing an FPS. Prime Remastered was the first game to actually use a twin-stick control scheme, and it being a remaster needed to sacrifice the ease of switching between beams or visors in order to make it work. Beyond was designed from the ground up to use a twin-stick approach, and it feels much better than anything else that came before it. It does mean that they were unable to include switching to different visors in the same way the previous games did, but they ended up combining all of the secondary visors into one anyway, so that's something that I can live with. The bigger problem is that in some ways this game feels like it wasn't designed around this setup. The game introduces the ability to free aim after you've locked onto a target, which feels awkward. This is something that was also in Prime 3, but that game required you to use the Wiimote's pointer controls. Even if you personally don't care for that, there's no denying that this kind of design works far better when you need to move your cursor independent of the camera. It was slightly less awkward when using the Switch 2's mouse mode, but I doubt that this was decided on late enough in development for that to have been a factor. On the topic of mouse mode, I was excited for that in particular. Despite not being a massive PC gamer, I much prefer playing any first-person game with a mouse when I can, so the fact that Prime 4 lets you use the Joy-Con mouse to aim was a major reason why I went out of my way to buy the upgraded version, even more so than the actual technical boost. Unfortunately, I don't think the Joy-Cons are particularly comfortable as mice. Maybe I just needed to get used to them, but every single time I tried them, I ended up quickly jumping back to the standard control layout. These are both very minor complaints though. Beam switching is back, having been absent from Prime 3. The first Prime game deviated from the series by having the player swap between the different beam weapons instead of having them as separate upgrades to your basic arm cannon. It was a good idea in theory, but in practice it's one of the weaker elements of an otherwise fantastic game. Your power beam is almost objectively the best weapon for the job in nearly any given encounter until the very end of the game when it's outclassed by the plasma beam, and the only time you're ever really incentivized to swap to a different beam is when the game forces you to by making specific enemies and doors immune to all other beams. Echoes and Hunters took it a step further by giving the different beam types special ammunition and making them far more powerful and varied to balance things out. It's certainly an improvement, but I still end up feeling like I'm swapping back to the standard power beam more often than not, if only to conserve ammo. Prime 4 decided to cut the beams entirely and instead treats the different shot types as secondary weapons, not unlike the missiles. I personally think that this is a good change as it prevents me from accidentally wasting ammo every time I want to shoot at a door. I also think that the game does a better job of making me want to use the different shot types in combat, though I wish they could have come up with something a little more creative than the same fire, ice, and electric attacks that we had in the first Prime game. The enemy variety has been one of the more minor points of criticism surrounding this game, and while I do agree that it's a problem, I think it hurts the world building of the game far more than it does the actual gameplay. One of the strengths of the Metroid Prime games in general is how well they immerse you in a world that feels like a living ecosystem, and a big part of that is how varied the different creatures you find would be. In Prime 4, the only area that feels like it has an acceptable amount of variation in its creature design is Fury Green, and even then just barely. The rest of the areas all have variations of the same few enemies, and it makes for a game that feels significantly less alive. It almost feels like it was intentional, as if they wanted to give the impression that this was a dying world, but if that was the case, then why even bother with the few enemies they did make? While the standard enemies were a disappointment, the bosses certainly are not. I'd go as far as to say that Beyond Handily has the best bosses in the entire Prime sub-series. One of them even has you shooting the control beam into its mouth in what seems to be an homage to the final boss of Metroid 2, which is a fun thing to see in Prime. There are one or two stinkers there, but the others are all a lot more interesting than the majority of bosses in the first game especially. The way the game uses Samus's abilities is shaky at best. Most returning items have a new feature connected to the idea that she has psychic powers now, and they range from being able to pick up your bombs to use in the most basic of puzzles to using the boost ball to watch a boring cutscene where you zip around an invisible track to pick up a floating item. It's a similar issue to Twilight Princess, where the items you obtain have new features that are so niche that the developers have to go out of their way to give them arbitrary uses, only here the new features feel like they exist purely to check off a box. As if to say, see? This game is totally different from the other ones. Samus can use the Force now, even though I'd argue that the game really didn't need that kind of gimmick to stick out. It doesn't feel like they gave Samus psychic powers because they felt like it would be a fun thing to include. It feels like they did it because they needed to set the game apart from the older games, not realizing that nobody would have complained if the bombs just worked the exact same way they did in every other Metroid game. I actually really enjoy the control beam and how it's used in the level and enemy design. It's nothing groundbreaking, but the slowdown feature is quite fun to use, and I found myself using it in combat more than I thought I would. Viola is the only other fully new ability in the game, and while I don't think it's a bad inclusion, I do think that it could have benefited from far more polish. It's primarily used in the desert as your main mode of transport. It feels good to control most of the time, but it's hard to make small adjustments, which can be a problem when the main thing to collect are bunches of crystals that you need to smash into. There is a slide move that seems like it's supposed to help with this, but you can only use it while you're boosting, which just exacerbates the issue. I found myself dismounting so I could use a charge shot to destroy the crystals I missed far more than I think should have been reasonable, which can be a problem because all of the enemies in the desert were clearly designed for you to fight while riding a bike. There is a targeting attack on the bike, but it doesn't feel good to use, and I ended up avoiding enemies more often than not. It doesn't even work on the crystals, which could have easily remedied the previous issue. The trailers for the game made it seem like the bike was going to be useful in places other than the desert, but in reality the game only lets you use it in one or two specific locations outside of it, so this feels less like an addition to Samus's arsenal and more like an excuse to have the desert just be a change of pace from the rest of the game. I don't necessarily have an issue with that by itself, but it does make the new suit design feel less meaningful since its only purpose is to summon the bike. Scans are back, but they're surprisingly one of the weaker elements of the game. In previous Prime games, the scans are used as the main method of conveying info to the player. There's plenty of things to scan, ranging from gameplay-relevant details to inconsequential flavor text to entire lore dumps. Arguably one of the first game's biggest strengths is how none of its plot is told to you through actual dialogue. Instead, it's up to the player to figure out the story for themselves through exploration. It's like the memories in Breath of the Wild, but, you know, good. Prime 2 and 3 were relatively restrained in comparison, opting for having NPCs give the player a rough idea of what's going on and what their goal is. Both games still heavily use scans in their world building. In fact, I would argue that Echoes is even better about it than the first game, but they opted for a mix of approaches rather than just a silent adventure. Prime 4 isn't even on the map in this regard. The vast majority of scans are completely meaningless, and it takes hours before you'll start to find any that even hint at a greater story. The other games had their fair share of unimportant scans too, but they were all color-coded by importance so you would know exactly which ones were necessary to continue or important parts of the lore. Prime 4 does this too, but the important scans are so few and far between that I legitimately forgot they were colored yellow until I replayed the game for footage. So how does the game communicate its story to the player? Well... Everywhere around the internet in the few days leading up to this game's release, the only thing anyone would talk about surrounding the game was this guy right here and his quote, MCU tier writing. It got so bad that even some big-name Nintendo YouTubers were throwing borderline temper tantrums over it, and like, come on. Nothing he says in this clip is anywhere close to being as bad as you all are making it out to be. In fact, I think that for the most part, Miles' dialogue tends to be pretty natural, all things considered. Not amazing, mind you, but pretending that it's this constant stream of quips that do nothing but break the atmosphere is ridiculous. Miles is fine. The rest of the characters are actually pretty awful.
Remember me?
I'd like to make something very clear here. Having NPCs in a Metroid game is not an inherently bad idea. So many of the complaints surrounding these NPCs revolve around how their mere existence ruins the atmosphere of isolation that Metroid revolves around. I don't necessarily disagree, but you have to look at this from another perspective. Metroid isn't exactly known for having an intricate or complex story by any means, but there's only so many ways you can write a story around Samus being the only character on a planet that used to have a thriving alien civilization before something bad happened to them. Eventually, you need to have someone for Samus to interact with. The challenge is finding a balance between isolation and interaction. Fusion is generally regarded as having one of the better stories in the series, and it accomplished this by adding a companion character in the form of Adam. There's still a sense of isolation in this game, even bordering on horror at times. Similarly, Prime 3 was the first game to heavily feature the Galactic Federation as a series of interactable characters, going as far as having the entire intro take place on a cruiser and military base being attacked by space pirates. It also has 3 separate bounty hunters that Samus is allied with and form the emotional core of the story, as she has to kill each of them after they've been corrupted by Phazon. These elements were divisive, no doubt, but considering that this was the finale of the trilogy and the moments where you interact with the characters form a small portion of the game, I think it's a nice change of pace to have the Federation take a more active role for once. Of course, the positive instances of this always leave people's minds when discussing the concept of NPCs in a Metroid game due to the collective trauma of Other M, and I don't blame them. I'm not saying that Metroid needs to have a ton of NPCs talking to Samus. I am saying that having more friendly characters isn't an idea that should be dismissed out of hand just because Other M sucked. I actually like what Prime 4 tries to do with its NPCs on paper. There's still a level of isolation and fear in what's going on, but ordinarily those emotions are exclusive to you as you put yourself in Samus's high jump boots. In this game, she's more isolated than she's ever been before. She's almost always been able to go back to her ship and leave, and when she can't, she's being assisted by a character of some sort. This time, not only has she been warped to an unknown planet with no hope of rescue, but her companions are people who are just as isolated and nowhere near as capable as her. That's part of why I don't have a problem with what Miles has to say. He's an engineer that probably hasn't seen combat a day in his life trying to cope with the reality of the situation. The problem with the NPCs in Prime 4 has nothing to do with them ruining the atmosphere of the game or that they shouldn't be in a Metroid game to begin with. The problem is that the writing in this game is the actual worst. I know I defended Miles' dialogue in terms of tone, but that doesn't mean he's a well-written character. Very few of the things he says to you in person amount to anything more than generic technology guy babble, which is especially evident considering you need to speak to him in order to get your different beam types so he can say the exact same thing each time. He's also constantly holding your hand by messaging you when you don't need it. Metroid games have had a problem with telling the player too much ever since Prime 1. That game, along with 2 and 3, had your ship's computer tell you the exact location of the next item if you wandered around for too long, but it was only there as a band-aid solution because the map does a poor job of naturally leading you to where you need to go next. If you need proof, turn off the hint system next time you play Prime and try to find the gravity suit or X-ray visor on your own. It's one of the few major criticisms I have with the first game. Out of the Prime games, 4 is arguably the most intuitive one in terms of figuring out exactly where you need to go next, so had there not been any hand-holding whatsoever, that would have been a legitimate improvement for the series, but instead Miles talks to you so much that it makes Skyward Sword's Fee seem tame in comparison. Despite this, I still think Miles is one of the better inclusions of the bunch, and that's not a compliment. Duke is particularly bad with the most generic military tough guy dialogue you could possibly come up with. He talks like an Air Force JROTC sergeant who is way too into his job. Tokabi is just as bad, if not worse. I don't really tend to pick up on bad acting very well. George Lazenby happens to be one of my favorite James Bonds if you need proof.
This never happened to the other fella.
But even I could tell that Tokabi's VA was not doing a very good job here.
You were able to activate this. A map of the facility. But it's corrupted. You want to go there.
No hate towards Kalani Kwepo here, obviously. After all, it could have just been an issue with direction, but he is incredibly wooden here, and the Temu Metal Gear Solid dialogue does not help. He's also the only character that they attempt to develop at all past his introduction, and all it amounts to is generic religious warrior cliches. VUE-995 is a robot, and I cannot remember a single other thing about them. They were introduced so late into the game that I was honestly surprised we were getting another character, and apparently the feeling was mutual over at Retro because he's barely utilized when you first encounter him. Armstrong is the only mildly fun character in a group of losers. You encounter her shortly after Duke, and at this point in the game I was fully expecting to dislike her just as much, only to be pleasantly surprised by her immediate reaction to seeing Samus being to stop everything and awkwardly fangirl over her hero. Unfortunately, after you leave the area you meet her in, they sort of drop that aspect and she goes back to being just as generic as everyone else, but the first impression was enough to make her my favorite. She's still only the best by default, though. Once you get to the last area, all of your companions sans Miles come to help, only for them to each get offed one by one in a Halo Reach wannabe self-sacrifice sequence. Don't worry though, because Metroid Prime 4 makes sure to add brilliant twists to the trope, such as having Tokabi defend against hordes of monsters with nothing more than a sniper rifle, Having Duke use the mining drill to cover the hole in the ground to block monsters whose entire gimmick is being able to dig through rock, having Armstrong do the exact same thing even though she clearly did not need to, and having the robot guy magically survive the first self-sacrifice only to be killed in a second self-sacrifice moments later. Oh, I'm sorry, did you dislike the fake-out self-sacrifice? Let me make that up to you by having every single character survive anyway. I'm actually baffled by this choice. It feels like just yesterday that we were watching videos dedicated to the crumbs of information that we were getting in the 8 years before this game, and we kept getting excited every time Retro Studios hired a new writer. If only we could see then the true brilliance that these hirings would let us witness. Oh, of course, all of them needed to survive so they could help you fight Silex. Silex himself is something of an anomaly. Whatever possessed Nintendo to choose one of the 6 rival hunters introduced in what is quite possibly the least talked about game in the entire series to be the main villain of Prime 4 is completely beyond me, but they made this decision all the way back in 2007 when they showed his ship in the secret ending of Prime 3. It's not like they had much of a plan with him though, because he doesn't do anything here. The intro makes it seem like he attacks the Federation base specifically because of the artifact that causes everyone to warp to Vuros in the first place, but he seems just as confused by the result as everyone else, and yet he's the final boss of the game despite having no connection to any prior events in the game beyond occasionally sending the robots he found to attack Samus. He's only given backstory through a single confusing cutscene that requires you to either 100% the game or use an amiibo to see. The game gives you short snippets of this cutscene every once in a while just by playing the game normally, but it doesn't really explain why Samus is bombarded by these visions. The last you see him, he's being held back by your companions as Samus leaves them to die. Not only does this feel incredibly rushed, contrived, poorly explained, and out of character for Samus, but the fact that we never see Silex and the Federation troopers die combined with a borderline incomplete backstory makes it seem like they're trying to set up for a follow-up of some sort. Maybe Samus will get into Fortnite after all so we can hear Silex's laughter in an event where they announce Prime 5. The writing in this game is actually embarrassing, possibly even worse than the writing in Other M. I really shouldn't be so surprised though. This is coming from a corporation that thought every Zelda product released in the past 3 years had writing acceptable enough to publish. It truly sucks because the concept was there, but instead this only feeds into the series' current track record of comically bad writing. If that were the only major issue though, I think this game would still largely be well liked. The desert is the other big point of criticism surrounding Prime 4, and not without reason. When it was first announced, I was worried about the concept. As someone who doesn't care for the current direction of The Legend of Zelda, to put it lightly, the absolute last thing I wanted was for Nintendo to ruin another of my favorite series by making it as big and open as possible with no respect for the player's time or willingness to trudge through a shallow open world. Luckily, the result is far more restrained than initial fears would lead you to believe, and the entire thing feels less like the focus of the game and more like the overworld in the older 3D Zeldas. It's a buffer zone to act as a change of pace for a few minutes while you get to the next major area, and from that perspective, I think it does the job well enough. The map isn't exceptionally big, and it takes 2 minutes at most to cross. That alone makes me dislike it far less than the overworld in nearly every 3D Zelda after Majora's Mask, though visually speaking it's far less interesting. Content in the desert ranges from your standard ammo expansions and upgrades to your bike's boost ability to collectible green crystals and oh come on, you're not even trying to hide the Breath of the Wild influence now. There are only 6 shrines in the desert. The puzzles inside of them usually amount to nothing more than using one of your elemental beams exactly once and performing only the most basic of tasks with a psychic ability. They aren't exactly head-scratchers, and I can't help but wish that they put a little more effort into both the quantity and quality of them. They're still better than the shrines in Tears of the Kingdom though, for whatever that's worth. I will say that I do think they do a good job of rewarding the player, giving upgrades to the elemental weapons. There's also a robot that you can find that will reveal points of interest on the minimap for you, which I think is nice but should have been placed in a less out-of-the-way spot. Overall, I think that the quantity of content in the overworld is passable, but I also feel like it just barely meets that threshold. A few more shrines or interesting landmarks could have gone a long way. I do understand that I'm far more forgiving of Soul Valley than most others are. Some people are acting like this is the worst thing to ever be included in a Metroid game, but I don't even think it's the worst thing to be included in this Metroid game. If you want to make the argument that an overworld isn't something that you personally want to see in the series, then I can understand and maybe even be inclined to agree, but for what it is, I think it's an alright idea with a so-so execution. If nothing else, I absolutely prefer traveling through an overworld to get to the different sub-areas over flying between planets in a cutscene like you do in Hunters and Corruption. My problem with the overworld has less to do with the content itself and more so how the game is structured around that content. Since the game is now segmented in an Ocarina of Time styled map, that means that the different areas feel far less connected than in Prime 1 or 2. This also has a negative impact on world building, but more importantly it means that the individual areas themselves need to be a lot more interesting than usual. Many of the different areas in the first game were far more linear than people tend to remember them. The Magmoor Caverns in particular were basically just a straight line connecting the Chozo ruins to Phendrana. You don't see a lot of people complaining about that though, because the caverns themselves were connected in more than just one place and had far more interesting room layouts than just being a simple hallway. Even Ocarina of Time had shortcuts letting you travel between different locations within the game. Prime 4's areas don't have that benefit, so they desperately needed to stand on their own as interesting pieces of level design. To its credit, the game starts out very strong. Fury Green doesn't seem like the most unique location in the series, but it's highly detailed and filled with plenty of variation in location and enemies. The next area, Volt Forge, might be one of my favorite locations in the series in terms of sheer atmosphere. These two areas are fantastic for early game locations, and while their layouts aren't spectacular, I was willing to ignore that because I was generally enjoying myself and expected the next three areas to only get better. Unfortunately, the best of the game was already behind me. The generic ice area was a step down from the rest of the game, being nothing more than a straight corridor until you get to a certain point, only then to make you come back up to fight the same enemies that you fought not too long ago. The Prime games have always struggled with map screens that seem borderline unreadable at times, but this is probably the worst example of that yet. I also gave this one a pass because I thought the story was finally starting to get mildly interesting here, but it was a noticeable downgrade from the first third of the game in every other respect. The generic fire area was even worse, but it was the final generic mines area that finally got me to admit that this game maybe wasn't as good as I had hoped. I could have maybe had something better to say if you ever came back to these areas for an extended period of time to explore large portions of the map that you couldn't before, like in Skyward Sword, but aside from a few minor excursions to Volt Forge, the game really doesn't do that. There are plenty of moments in the individual areas where collectibles are locked behind items you don't have yet, but I never felt incentivized to find them because the game never makes it convenient to. The game frequently forces you to return to Fury Green since that's where your companions set up home base, and there are one or two other points of interest in the rooms immediately surrounding them, but you're never told to go any deeper than that. There's a noticeable portion of this map that you'll never return to in a game from a series where backtracking is one of its main appeals. It has a negative effect on the upgrades too. So many of the items are given to you so late into the game that they never feel rewarding to obtain. The super missiles in particular are practically worthless past the room you get them in, which is wild to think about considering how prevalent they are in previous games. Here they're slightly useful against the boss of the last major area, after which I promptly forgot about them. Even disregarding the major items, the game in general seems to have an issue with saving a lot of its potentially interesting content until well after it should have. Playing through the game normally, it takes about an hour and a half before you get your first taste of the overworld, and that's only so you can get to the Volt Forge and complete another large portion of the game. By the time you're allowed to freely explore with a motorcycle, you're already about a third of the way through the content. Once I got here, I took the opportunity to explore, only to realize that the vast majority of things to find require items I didn't have yet. I don't necessarily have an issue with a large portion of content requiring later items, but in my first run through the overworld I only managed to find a single missile expansion that I could collect. Backtracking to find collectibles you couldn't obtain initially is a large part of what makes Metroid games so fun, but usually that's balanced with an equally large quantity of items that you can collect as soon as you see them, so that you can still feel like you've earned something in the moment. That first time I went through the desert, I only felt like I thoroughly wasted my time. Miles initially tells you that you can do the remaining areas out of order, which simultaneously got me excited and nervous. A game letting you do things out of order can make it significantly more interesting or ruin any sense of progression you have in it. From the way things looked, it seemed like Beyond was going to give me the different shot types I needed in each of the three remaining areas, which could have meant that each area was designed to feel completely different based on what previous areas you've already done. This was the best case scenario, but as it turns out the game just lied to you and you're forced to do everything in a set order. I'm not saying that I'm upset that I can't do things out of order, but it does make me wonder why they even bothered pretending otherwise, as it seems like a very easy thing to communicate to the player that it's not the case. This is a minor complaint though. What isn't a minor complaint is how the game is structured towards the end. The previous numbered Metroid Prime games each had a late game collectathon segment that was required to beat the game, and for the most part you could only do it after finishing everything else. These are commonly considered the worst parts of each respective entry, and I have no clue why anyone at Nintendo or Retro insists on bringing that trope back. It must be popular with someone over there though, because there are not one, but two of them this time. The first one isn't that bad. You have to find Federation containers scattered across the desert and get the 6 parts to repair a big mech to break through the shield of the tower in the center. By the time I unlocked the ability to even grab them, I had already found the location of 5 of them, and after an incredibly boring boss fight, it was just a matter of taking the 10 minutes out of my life to drive to each. It's not exactly fun, but it's easily the least tedious implementation of this trope in the series. The other one is far worse. The only thing in the desert that you have access to from the very beginning are green energy crystals for you to smash into with your bike. These let you fill a meter back at home base, rewarding you with goodies the more you fill. The problem with this is not only that it's required, but also that filling the meter is unbearably slow. My first few times going around the map I expected to at least get something for the trouble of smashing so many crystals, but I ended up getting squat. You do eventually get rewards for every 25% of the meter that you fill, but only 2 of them are particularly useful in normal gameplay, and one of those you don't even get until the very end. It would help if all of the crystals were available from the start, but many don't even spawn until later on in the game, and a lot of the ones that do spawn require a special item to obtain. These large chunks of crystal are basically the only use for power bombs once you get them, as if they needed to think of a reason why you should care that you got the power bombs in the first place. By the time I got to the point where I needed the meter filled in order to get to the final boss, I was only about halfway there and needed to spend the next half an hour grinding. I've seen people argue that collecting these crystals is something that you're given the option to do very early on into the game, as well as the information that you'll need to do it. Therefore, any grinding you need to do at the end of the game is completely your fault. I can see where they're coming from and actually have a similar opinion regarding the Triforce quest in Wind Waker, but I don't think that argument works in Prime 4 for a couple of reasons. First, the game does such a poor job of communicating how many crystals you have and need at any given time. There's a collection tracker in the menu, but it only gives you a vague percentage instead of an exact number, and it's unclear as to whether it's referring to how many crystals you've collected or how many you've deposited in the receptacle. Second, there are a limited number of crystals in the world, and a large portion of them are locked behind late-game upgrades. Most of these crystals are in the aforementioned power bomb blocks, but many are also locked inside of shrines requiring the different beams to enter. If you don't want to grind at the very end of the game, your only other option is to spend even more time hunting down the few crystals that are available to you, which means having to spend even more time in the overworld than you otherwise would. On my second playthrough, I went out of my way to collect as many green crystals as I possibly could as early as I could in an attempt to get the legacy suit early. The best I managed to do was collect enough in time to get the upgraded power beam just before I entered the mines. I still needed to grind a little under half of the required amount while searching for the mech parts, and I think I had even less fun doing it that way. The worst part about this is that I think the crystals could have been a great inclusion if they had just made it optional and maybe even made it a little easier to fill the meter. Having a way to obtain powerful upgrades to your beam and suit early on could have been a great way to make the game feel less railroady and give the player some amount of agency. Instead, it's a poor implementation of an already bad trope, and the thing that tipped me over the edge from being relatively positive on this game to mostly critical. Metroid Prime 4 is not a bad game. I think that the mechanics in the moment can be a lot of fun, but it does feel like a shell of a Metroid game a lot of the time, and after 8 years of waiting since the game was first announced, I can see a lot of people being disappointed. I can't say that I'm not disappointed either, but I think many are being too quick to bash this game. I've seen some people claim that Beyond is worse than Other M just because it has an overworld and NPCs that tell you where to go, which I think is absolutely taking things a step too far. Prime 4 is not the worst Metroid. I don't even think I'd call it the worst Metroid Prime if only because Federation Force and Hunters exist. I don't think I could go as far as to recommend it to anyone other than the most diehard of series fans, though. There are far better Metroid games available on the platform, both Prime and otherwise. Most of them are cheaper than even the Switch 1 version of Beyond. There are a lot of things here that I like in concept, and the first few hours are a great time, but the execution is fumbled hard and the game only gets worse the further into it that you go. I get the feeling that a significant portion of the people working on it didn't fully know what they were doing or why people like Metroid Prime in the first place. If the 8 years of waiting, including the announcement that they were restarting development, weren't evidence enough that this game was in development hell, then the end result seems to outright confirm it. Something went wrong behind the scenes with this game, and I'd be interested to find out the full story behind its obviously troubled development eventually. We've already gotten a Famitsu interview about this game, shedding light on many of the questionable choices behind it as well as revealing that it takes place after Super Metroid, what the fuck? If nothing else, I'd like to end this rather depressing review with something a little more hopeful. I've been comparing this game to many others: Twilight Princess, Breath of the Wild, Halo, and obviously various Metroid games. I want to throw one more in there though. Samus Returns. This game was similarly announced at a time where the future of the Metroid series was uncertain. At the time, it was also a beacon of hope for fans of the series, though it ended up being a commercial flop, and while it's still a good game, it's generally regarded as one of the weaker 2D entries. Part of that was because it was Mercury Steam's first time developing a Metroid game. Not only was it a remake of one of the weirder titles, but one that added many new experimental mechanics. The result was a rather awkward game that was anything but what the series needed at the time, and fans were left waiting again. That is, until 4 years later when Metroid Dread was announced, a game that refined the controversial mechanics of Samus Returns into one of the most well-received games in the entire series, and the best-selling entry too. Prime 4 doesn't fail because it tries new things, it fails because it doesn't fully understand what those changes demand. I'm not saying that the next Prime game, whenever we eventually get it, needs to have an overworld or a story that heavily revolves around NPCs. I am saying that just because this game may have been a disappointment doesn't mean that we should lose hope for the future of the series, and if Retro and Nintendo learned from the mistakes of this good but heavily flawed game, we could very easily see them release a masterpiece that rivals even the first Prime. I can only hope that it takes them less than 18 years this time.